It was a sunny afternoon in Florida, and the political landscape was buzzing. The air was thick with tension as prominent figures prepared for yet another round of debates. Among the crowd of speakers was Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida. She had already made a name for herself as a tough and formidable figure in the political arena. Yet, there was a new challenge waiting for her today, one that came in the form of a sharply dressed liberal journalist, Dylan Foster. Dylan had earned a reputation for being fearless, often digging deep into the political misdeeds of conservatives. His latest target was none other than Pam Bondi. Rumors had been swirling about her past decisions as Attorney General, and Dylan had an arsenal of questions ready, designed to humiliate and expose her. The event was a press conference, open to the public and filled with reporters from all sides of the political spectrum. Pam was preparing for her turn at the podium when Dylan raised his hand. His eyes gleamed with anticipation. He was ready to make his move. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice loud and cutting through the chatter in the room. "You've made a career out of defending the interests of the powerful. You've taken millions from special interest groups and yet, when asked about your ties to corporations, you've been eerily silent. Is this the kind of leadership we should expect from someone in your position?" The room went silent, every eye in the room fixed on Pam Bondi. She was unflappable, her face a mask of calm professionalism, but inside, she could feel the weight of the accusation bearing down on her. Pam Bondi stood still for a moment, the weight of the question lingering in the air. She could feel the sharp gaze of every reporter in the room, all waiting for her response. Dylan Foster's eyes never left her, his expression one of smug certainty, as if he already knew the answer would falter. But Pam wasn't about to let him, or anyone else, rattle her. She took a deliberate breath, then turned her gaze toward him. The room, already hushed, seemed to grow even quieter, as if the very air had become thick with the anticipation of her reply. "Dylan," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm sure you're used to people crumbling under your kind of questioning, but let me assure you, I'm not most people." There was a brief pause, just long enough to let the weight of her words sink in. Dylan shifted in his seat, clearly expecting an answer full of deflection or irritation. Instead, what came next would silence not only him but the entire room. "You ask about corporate ties, about special interests," she continued, her voice unflinching. "What you fail to realize is that I've spent my career fighting for the people of Florida, working to make sure that our state is a place where businesses can thrive, where jobs are created, and where families are protected. You want to talk about special interests? Let's talk about your friends in the liberal media who manipulate narratives to fit their agendas. You want to talk about ties to the powerful? Let's talk about the countless times you've used your platform to advance causes that benefit the wealthy elite, all while claiming to fight for the little guy." Her eyes locked onto his, her gaze cold and unyielding. "You see, Dylan, the real question isn't about my integrity. It's about yours. How far will you go to push a narrative that isn't true? How many times will you sacrifice the truth for a headline?" The room was absolutely still. Even the other reporters seemed to be holding their breath. Dylan's confident smirk faltered, and for a split second, his posture gave way to something resembling uncertainty. He quickly regained his composure, but it was clear that Pam's response had hit home. Dylan Foster's face twitched ever so slightly, a crack in his previously unwavering confidence. For the first time, Pam saw the familiar armor of the liberal journalist begin to show signs of wear. The room had fallen completely silent, save for the soft shuffle of pens on paper and the tapping of keyboards. Dylan cleared his throat, trying to regain the upper hand. "I'm not here to debate your record, Ms. Bondi. I'm here to ask you about accountability. About your failure to protect Floridians from corruption. Surely, you understand the gravity of these issues, right?" Pam's smile was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried a sense of quiet victory. It wasn't just a response that had silenced him, it was her ability to turn the tables on the very accusations he had aimed at her. "Accountability?" Pam repeated, her voice dropping to a level that commanded respect. "I've spent my career making the tough calls. It's easy to sit in your ivory tower, pointing fingers, but you've never had to deal with the real-world consequences of those decisions, have you?" Dylan hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Pam leaned forward, her voice growing more intense as she delivered the next blow. "While you sit there and question my integrity, know this, Dylan. I've fought against human trafficking, defended Florida's most vulnerable citizens, and made decisions that weren't always popular but were the right ones. And I've done it while facing a never-ending barrage of attacks from people like you, who would rather see me fail than see Florida succeed. But I'm still here. I'm still standing. And I'll keep fighting, whether you like it or not." The journalists around the room exchanged glances, clearly processing the weight of her words. Dylan's face flushed with embarrassment. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, fumbling for a response that would restore his momentum. "Do you have anything else to say?" Pam's voice cut through the tension, her tone daring him to continue. Dylan opened his mouth but then stopped. No words came. His confidence had evaporated, leaving him grasping for something, anything to salvage his position. Pam had won this round, and she wasn't done. The room remained eerily quiet, the atmosphere thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Pam Bondi stood tall at the podium, her posture a silent testament to the strength she had just displayed. Dylan Foster, the once cocky liberal journalist who had walked in with such confidence, now appeared deflated, his face flushed with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. Pam's gaze never wavered from him as she addressed the room. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," she began, her voice strong and unwavering, "that truth and integrity matter more than headlines and agendas. This isn't about who can shout the loudest or spin the best narrative, it's about who is actually doing the work to protect people, to make a difference, and to hold those who harm our communities accountable." Dylan shifted uncomfortably, unable to muster a comeback. The reporters in the room were still, too shocked by the sudden turn of events to even think of interrupting her. Pam continued, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "We live in a time where the loudest voices often aren't the most informed," she said, her tone never losing its edge. "Where the media would rather create a sensational story than report the truth. But I won't let that stop me from doing what's right. I've spent years in the trenches, working with law enforcement, fighting corruption, and standing up for the people who need it most. And that's not something anyone, especially not a journalist with an agenda, can take away from me." She paused, letting her words sink in, then turned her attention back to Dylan, who was still standing there, visibly struggling to come up with a response. "You're welcome to try again, Dylan," Pam said, her voice smooth but tinged with a quiet authority. "But don't expect me to back down." Dylan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He took a step back, clearly realizing that the battle he thought he could win was already over. With no more retorts to offer, he quietly lowered his gaze and took his seat. Pam didn't need to say anything else. The silence that followed was enough to convey the magnitude of the moment. She had not only defended herself, but in doing so, she had dismantled every pretense that Dylan had built up around his questions. As the press conference continued, the reporters who had been watching this exchange began to scribble down notes, though many of them seemed less focused on the questions and more captivated by the powerful way Pam had handled the situation. Her message was clear, her authority undeniable. Pam Bondi had silenced her critics, not with anger or deflection, but with truth, strength, and an unshakable resolve. The press conference came to a close soon after Pam's exchange with Dylan. The journalists filed out, murmuring among themselves, their voices a blend of admiration and disbelief. Pam had handled the situation with a poise and confidence that left an indelible impression. Dylan, who had entered the room with the intent to bring her down, now walked out with his tail between his legs. His usual bravado had dissolved into silence. He had underestimated Pam Bondi, and it was clear that the fallout from this encounter would linger for some time. As Pam stepped off the stage, a few of her allies approached her, their faces lit with quiet approval. One of them, a fellow conservative politician, patted her on the back. "You nailed it, Pam," he said with a grin. "You really put him in his place." Pam smiled, but it was a measured smile, one that acknowledged the victory without becoming overly triumphant. She had been in this game long enough to know that it wasn't about winning individual battles, it was about standing firm, even when the odds were stacked against you. As she walked toward the exit, she was met with the gaze of a few remaining reporters, who had stayed behind to get her final thoughts. Pam stopped and faced them, ready to wrap up the day with one last statement. "It's not enough to simply speak out against the system," she said, her voice firm and unyielding. "You have to be willing to stand in the fire and take the heat. I've been questioned, attacked, and vilified, but I'll keep standing. Not just for me, but for the people who need someone to fight for them. If you want to question me, that's fine. But know this, I'm not going anywhere." The reporters were silent for a moment, clearly processing the weight of her words. Finally, one of them spoke up, almost hesitantly. "Do you think this will change the way people view you after today?" Pam's eyes softened slightly, but her answer was direct. "I don't care how people view me. I care about what I do, what I've done, and what I'll continue to do. The truth has a way of coming out, even when the noise gets loud." With that, Pam walked away, leaving the reporters behind, stunned by her resolute demeanor and the undeniable force of her words. The aftermath of the encounter would ripple through the media for days to come. Dylan Foster's reputation took a hit as stories about the exchange spread, painting him as the journalist who had been schooled by his conservative opponent. On social media, clips of Pam's response were shared by thousands, garnering support from her allies and raising her profile even further. But for Pam Bondi, this wasn't just a victory over one journalist. It was a reminder to everyone who had ever doubted her, she was a force to be reckoned with. And no one, liberal journalist or otherwise, was going to silence her. The days following Pam's public encounter with Dylan Foster were nothing short of explosive. The media landscape was flooded with commentary, ranging from praise to criticism, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. But what struck Pam most was how quickly the narrative shifted. What had started as an attempt to discredit her, to expose her as a politician beholden to corporate interests, had backfired in a way no one expected. Her response was everywhere: social media, news outlets, conservative blogs, and even some liberal commentary. The clip of her silencing Dylan went viral, with thousands of views and countless shares. Pam didn't pay much attention to the media storm. She was used to the chaos. But as the dust settled, she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. People were beginning to see her differently, not just as a politician, but as a force in her own right, a woman who could hold her ground under pressure. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing paperwork, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. She opened it, and the message was simple: "You've got their attention now. Don't let up." Pam read the message several times, trying to understand the meaning behind it. It could have been a supporter, a colleague, or perhaps someone from her own camp offering encouragement. But what struck her was the timing. Whoever had sent this message was keenly aware of the political momentum she had just gained. She leaned back in her chair, considering her next move. The entire episode had raised her profile significantly, there was no denying that. The question now was what to do with that attention. Did she continue to ride the wave, or did she use this opportunity to pivot and take a more strategic approach? She knew there were risks either way. The right move could propel her even further into the political spotlight, the wrong one could bring the same forces that had tried to undermine her back into full force. That evening, Pam received another call. This time, it was from one of her closest allies, a well-known Florida senator. "Pam," the senator said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk. Your response to Dylan Foster has put you in a strong position, but we're seeing some movement from the other side. They're organizing. And they're coming for you." Pam's instincts kicked in. She had known this would happen. After a win, the counterattacks were always swift. "Tell me what's going on," she replied, her tone steady but focused. "They're building a narrative around you being a puppet for corporate interests," the senator explained. "They're trying to paint you as someone who's too cozy with big business. They've already started with new smear campaigns. You've made a lot of enemies with that comeback. And they'll use every tool in their arsenal to tear you down." Pam thought for a moment, her mind racing through the possible next steps. She knew this battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. "You're right," she said, finally, her voice cold with resolve. "But let them come. If they want a fight, I'll give them one. I've survived worse." Pam Bondi didn't waste any time after her conversation with the senator. She knew that every political battle, no matter how small or large, had consequences. And this one was going to be no different. If her critics thought she was going to back down after taking down Dylan Foster, they had another thing coming. Over the next week, she worked tirelessly, meeting with her political team, strategizing, and preparing for the inevitable onslaught. She knew the smear campaigns were coming. She knew the attacks would grow fiercer and more personal. But she also knew that she had something her enemies didn't, the truth on her side. The attacks, as expected, came in full force. Ads appeared on TV, radio, and social media, depicting Pam as a puppet for corporate interests, someone who had sold out the people of Florida for personal gain. The narrative was clear: Pam was out of touch with the everyday Floridian, and her entire career had been built on backroom deals. But instead of responding with defensiveness or anger, Pam chose to lean into the very accusations they were making. She took the fight to them head-on. The next week, she held a press conference. "Let's talk about corporate interests," Pam began, her voice calm, but her eyes flashing with intensity. "You want to say I'm too close to big business? Let's talk about the years I spent as Attorney General fighting to hold corporations accountable. Let's talk about the battles I fought to protect Floridians from fraudulent practices and shady business dealings." The reporters gathered in front of her were stunned at the shift in tone. Pam wasn't defending herself. She was turning their narrative into a weapon. "I'll admit it," she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word, "I've worked with businesses. Because in Florida, businesses create jobs. They fuel our economy. But I've also fought against them when they've tried to take advantage of the people I swore to protect. That's the difference between me and the people who are trying to tear me down. They can't say the same thing." She looked directly into the cameras, her eyes fierce and unrelenting. "And let's be clear, those who would rather spread lies and smears about me are the ones who have always been cozy with corporate elites. They've allowed special interests to dictate policy while pretending to stand up for the little guy. But I've never done that. I've fought for the people of Florida, no matter who it's against." The room fell silent. Pam's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. This wasn't just a response, it was a declaration of war against her critics. She wasn't backing down, and she wasn't going to let anyone rewrite her story. The media took notice. What had once been a campaign to discredit her had transformed into something far more significant. Pam wasn't just defending her reputation, she was redefining her legacy. The attacks only fueled her fire. And soon, the tide began to turn. Her supporters rallied behind her, organizing rallies, pushing back against the smear campaigns, and sharing her message far and wide. On the other side, the smear campaign lost steam as more and more Floridians saw through the attacks. The people who had tried to tear her down were now the ones on the defensive. Pam Bondi had done the unthinkable, she had turned the tables, not with anger or desperation, but with truth, strength, and determination. She had faced down a journalist, taken on the smear machine, and emerged stronger than ever. In the end, it wasn't just a victory for Pam, it was a victory for anyone who had ever been underestimated, anyone who had ever been silenced by the media or political elite. She had proven that no matter how fierce the fight, no matter how deep the attacks, a politician with conviction could rise above it all. Pam Bondi wasn't just a survivor in the political game, she had become a force to be reckoned with. And her enemies? They had learned that you don't humiliate Pam Bondi, you only make her stronger.